Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever part of the day you are watching it is perfectly a-okay. Welcome to day 8 of Brian's Winter. Today we will be reading chapters 10 and 11. Before we get into those chapters, though, I want to quickly do a couple quick shout outs. First off, shout out to everybody who's been tuning in over the past 8 days. It means a lot, and I'm just so happy that we still get to connect every day, some way or somehow. Um, I want to shout out Miss Atlee because she did an amazing e-yoga session. Mr. Jones actually just got done doing it. Mr. Jones is there. There's a bunch of other kipsters there. It was fun. If you have not been to one of Miss Atlee's yoga sessions yet, you should go. They are every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on Zoom. I think she posted a link on Dojo to find it. So yeah, Mr. Jones is happy to be sitting down because my legs are sore from doing Warrior 3 and Warrior 2 and Warrior 1 and all that. A couple other shout outs. I want to shout out Delon. I just got done talking to him and Mom, and he's been doing a super good job. I had to help him figure out how to get around this. Sometimes this is coming up as blocked. If this comes up as blocked for you or unavailable, please let Mr. Jones know. I'm trying my best to make sure it's public every day, but every day people have been telling me, sometimes one person or another student has been telling me that sometimes it comes up blocked. If it ever comes up blocked, please let Mr. Jones know so I can figure out how to fix it. But shout out to Delon for persevering. We got it set up, and he got his read aloud done. As you see, I'm wearing option 6 again. Shout out to Yuritsa. She let Mr. Jones know that this is what she wanted, and she was the only person that voted, so wearing my sunglasses. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into chapter 10. So we know that chapters 8 and 9 were the first two chapters of part 2, where the winter is starting, and Brian is having some trouble with the winter, not only just because of how cold it's getting and he has to change his clothes, but also because there's less and less animals for him to hunt, and also because because there's less animals to hunt, that means that he has to basically fight with the other bigger animals who need to hunt as well. And we saw in chapter 9, he came face to face with the moose. He actually wanted to hunt the moose, and the moose, right at the last second, when Brian shot his arrow, saw Brian shoot at him, and the moose was a girl. She attacked Brian, and that's where we were left off. And he shot the moose. The moose came back, and he hit the moose with the lance in the chest, and then Brian got knocked out for a period of time, and the chapter ended. So now, hopefully, in chapter 10 and 11, we can kind of see what happened after that encounter with the moose. Chapter 10. A great weight, something heavy on him. His mother was calling for him to come back. He was little again, a small boy and playing outside, and his mother was calling for him to come inside, but he couldn't move because there was a huge weight on him, holding him down, keeping him from coming home. Brian opened his eyes slowly, closed them against the brightness and the pain in his forehead, then opened them again. It was, he thought, the same world. Snow all around. Bright sun, he was breathing, had a pounding pain in his forehead. It reminded him of the plane crash, and had what appeared to be an entire cow moose in his lap. He twitched when he looked down at her. Her eyes still looked mad, and her head plowed against his chest, but he realized she was dead. He started to examine his own situation. Nothing seemed to be broken. He could not at first believe this, and moved his arms and legs several times to make certain, then squirmed his way out from beneath the moose. She was lying half on him, her head on his chest, pushing him back, and when he stood, it was the first time he got a long look at how big she was. From nose to back end, he guessed a good 8 or 9 feet, maybe more. He paced her off and came up with 4 paces in length, counting her legs, which were sticking out a bit, maybe 10 feet, and she was taller at the shoulder than he stood. He wondered for a moment if she was the same moose that had attacked him earlier in the summer, and tried to feel that she was, tried to feel some animosity toward her. But the truth was that killing her made him sad, elated and sad all at once, as he had been with the wolf-killed doe. She was ugly and beautiful at the same time, lying there in the snow, blood from her chest wounds smeared where she lay, an ugly, beautiful animal. And she was ended now. He had killed her, ended her life so that he could live, and he felt as bad as he felt good. He turned away for a moment, shook his head, and then turned back. There was much work to do, and for a moment he thought it would be impossible. It was perhaps half a mile back to camp, and there was absolutely no way he would be able to drag her. He tried lifting a back leg, and it was all he could do to get it off the ground. Dragging her would be simply impossible. She must weigh 600 or 700 pounds. He would have to cut her up here and take her back to camp in pieces, and that nearly stopped him. How, he thought, do you cut a moose up? Never in all his life had he ever thought about cutting a moose to pieces. Where did he start? There were no dotted lines the way there were in the diagram at the meat market. He thought on it a full 5 minutes, looking at her lying there, and finally realized he could do nothing until she was skinned. He used the knife to slit the inside from the neck, down the chest, and belly to the back end. He had to cut around the lance which had broken off after driving into her, and the arrow shafts still sticking out because they wouldn't pull free. The skin came away harder than with the dough, was thicker, and had to be cut loose as he skinned, peeling it back a half inch at a time all along her body. When he cut along the belly, the knife slipped and cut the membrane, holding the stomach in, and her guts fell out on his feet. Ugh. Steaming. And when he went ahead and pulled the rest of them out the way out, he was amazed at how much there was inside her. The liver alone weighed more than 2 rabbits, and he set it aside to cook later. When the guts were out of her, she was much easier to move. Still very hard, but some easier, and he quickly developed a rhythm for skinning. Pull on the hide, slide the knife along, pull, slide. In half an hour, he had lifted the hide completely off her right side, cutting it around the neck just under her head, and folded it over her back, completely exposing her right side. He had never, even in a butcher shop, seen so much meat in one place. She was a house of meat. Again, he lifted the back leg and couldn't move her, even with the guts out. But as he lifted the leg, he noted that there seemed to be a seam where the leg joined the body, a junction, and he put the knife there and cut, and the leg lifted away from the body. He kept lifting and cutting all around the top of the back leg, pushing up as he did so until it was joined only at the hip socket, which rotated freely, and he cut around the socket with the knife, and it popped loose and the leg lifted completely away. Just that, her back leg was heavier than the dough, and he realized it would be hard to get the leg back to the shelter. This would be a long job. He decided to pull the leg back and then return to finish up, an all-night job, and it would be cold. He took off with the leg and used nearly 2 minutes just to pull it to the shelter and was almost exhausted when he got there. He stored it along the wall and went back to where the body of the cow lay. It was now midday and he was starving. He took 15 minutes to gather wood and start a fire near the carcass, and when it was blazing well, he cut a strip of meat from the rump near where he lifted the leg off and hung it over a stick so that it was nearly in the flames. He went back to cutting and skinning while it cooked. He cut away the right front shoulder. It lifted off much the same as the rear leg, the shoulder blade cutting away, and then the leg, and he dragged it back to camp. And when he returned, the meat on the stick was perfect, burned a little on the outside, and cooked clear through. He cut pieces off and ate it standing there, looking down at the rest of the cow, and he thought he'd never tasted meat so good. It was better than deer, or rabbit, or full birds, better than beef. And there was fat on it, more fat than the dough had, and he craved fat. Ate one piece of fat alone that was hanging on the side of the meat and had cooked separately and still craved it. He cut 2 large pieces of fat off the carcass and hung them over the fire to cook while he went back to work. With the right legs gone, she was lighter, and by lifting the legs on the ground, he found he could just roll her over to get at the uncompleted side. Once she was over the skinned side, as he'd done the first one, working up to the back after cutting around the legs until the hide was completely free of the carcass. Then he cut the legs loose, dragged them one at a time back to camp, and returned to the body of the moose in darkness. Finding his way was no problem because there was a half moon and it lighted the snow into something close to daylight. But the cold came now and he had no gloves. His hands chilled as he worked on the damp meat, and he had to warm them up over the fire often, which slowed him, and by midnight everything in him screamed to stop. But the cow was a treasure house of food and hide, and he wasn't about to leave her for the wolves or the bear if it came along again, so he kept working. With the legs and rump gone, the remaining part of the carcass was not too hard to handle. He used the hatchet to chop through the spine in 2 places and separated the back, middle, and front end, and it amazed him how much all animals were alike. She was immense, but the cow was built almost like a rabbit, with the same basic layout. The same design, he thought, grinning, and supposed if he were on all fours, he would look the same. He cut her head away with the hatchet and dragged the front section of her body, the rib cage and the hump meat on top of her shoulders with it, back to the camp and then the rear end, and the center at the same time. That left only the hide and head. The head he could come back for tomorrow, and he set off with the hide at probably 4 in the morning. It was the worst. It was staggeringly heavy. He couldn't lift it, and dragging it back to the camp with his bow and arrows on top of it exhausted him. At camp, he looked at the pile of meat and hid next to a shelter wall, smiled once, shoved out of his rabbit skin shirt, crawled into his bag, and was in a deep, dreamless sleep in seconds. A good, no, he thought, his brain closing down. A great day, a meat day, a moose day. He would sketch it on the shelter wall tomorrow. Scene. All right, so in that chapter, we realized that Brian was knocked out for a little bit. He had a little weird daydream where he thought he was back home and his mom was telling him to come back home. Then he snapped out of it, woke up, and realized that he killed the moose and the moose was on top of him. After a little while trying to figure out if any bones were broken, if anything was hurt, he moved around for a little bit. He realized he was okay. He got up, and then he had to realize how was he going to take this big old moose back to his shelter. The moose, as he said, was 8 to 9 feet big. So he had to basically just cut it up in pieces and then take it back. And then he kind of had to persevere because it was very time consuming, and he knew that it was important to get that moose back all in the same day. But he was super tired. But he knew if he left it and went back to sleep, or he left it and came back the next day, the wolves might have got to it, the bears might have got to it, and might have brought them back to his shelter. So he had to persevere through and make sure that he could bring the moose back and have all that food and the hide and the fur that came with it as well. So with that being said, I want to ask you 2 questions to go along with this chapter. So the first thing Brian says is that when he looked at the moose when he first woke up in chapter 10 and he looked at it and saw it was dead, he was happy and sad at the same time. And he said something specific where he said that he wished that it was the same moose that attacked him earlier in the hatchet so that he would feel better about killing the moose, because he probably would have had a reason to kill it as opposed to just killing an innocent animal. So why do you think Brian said that? Why do you think Brian said that he wishes it was the moose from earlier that attacked him? And then the second question I want to ask is, what does this show about Brian's character? So if he says that, I feel kind of bad, I wish it was the moose from earlier, what does the show about his character, about how he feels about animals, and just about how he feels about killing or hurting things in general? All right, so you can write the answers down, you can type them out, make sure you send them to your teacher, you can discuss them with a friend or family member at home, and then we'll get right into chapter 11.